Hello, everybody, and good afternoon to you all. Welcome to Socialist Ireland's launch of Budget 2026. Let me just begin by screen sharing here. Okay, so with me today is Michelle Murphy and Suzanne Rogers, policy and research analysts, and Mansour Rawat, our economic and social analyst. Today we'll be looking through Socialist Ireland's proposals for budget 2026. Excuse me, everybody, there seems to be a few technical issues there. Apologies. So look, we'll make a start looking at the context for the budget. And from Socialist Ireland's perspective, fundamentally, this is a question of fairness is at the heart of our budget 2026 proposals. Ireland is wealthier than it's ever been before. However, notwithstanding that, there are 630 people in poverty, 190,000 of whom are children. Homelessness figures as of the most recent figures are in the region of 15,500 and exceeding that. We also see that last year's budget 2025, further increased the rich-poor gap, putting far more money into the pockets of somebody earning €100,000 a year than it put into the pockets of people on the lowest incomes. And all of that can be seen in our budget choices analysis, particularly on pages 15 and page 4. In terms of page 4, we also explore the temporary measures that were introduced in previous budgets and the legacy of those measures. Again, we see that the benefit of permanent measures were focused in high-income households, whereas the benefit to lower income households really came in the form of temporary measures which fade away. In terms of infrastructure and services, we know that there are significant deficits in our infrastructure and services. Obviously, the big obvious one is housing, but also we see that water infrastructure continues to be a major issue, and that was further again highlighted by the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, as well as ongoing infrastructure deficits in our healthcare system, public transport, etc. In terms of the fiscal stance for budget 2026, there's a number of things that government will need to consider. But really what's standing out for us this year is the fiscal context in which we see windfall corporation tax revenues are actually hiding an underlying deficit. And this is a real concern. The Department of Finance had already made clear that we were moving into major transitions in the future, one of which was deglobalization, and that would have an impact for our economic model. We know that we were already expecting to see windfall taxes from corporations decline in coming years. And obviously, the impact of the change of policy in the US with the election of Donald Trump has meant that has already been exacerbated and accelerated. There is continued uncertainty in our global, not only in our global economic order, but also in our geopolitics. And we see a rise in conflict internationally. And all of this can have an impact on the economy of our country, and as well as the well-being of people enduring those conflicts around the world. We also have international commitments, particularly around our climate change commitments, which have to be honoured, and that has an impact on our budgetary choices. In terms of the economic context, we have a booming international sector, but we actually also have a rather fragile domestic economy. And so there's a divergence in our economy that needs to be addressed. And of course, both of those are impacted by global changes. And then in terms of the social context, as we've already mentioned, we continue to see poverty and inequality. We continue to see large numbers of people struggling, and we continue to see a deficit in our shared infrastructure and services. Social Justice Ireland believes that, yes, we need to have a vibrant economy, but actually we need more than that. And we propose a new social contract. And we believe that Budget 2026, as the first budget of the new government, can be a first step towards realising such a new social contract. As you can see from the slide, we believe that, yes, a vibrant economy is essential, but we also require decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability and a just transition. And all of the recommendations that we lay out in this year's budget choices all work towards those 5 overarching policy objectives. Now, in terms of the budgetary stance that Social Justice Ireland has taken, fundamentally, we believe that there needs to be an increase in the overall tax take to secure the public finances. As we've seen, there's a significant underlying deficit when windfall taxes are removed from the pot. And we believe that over the long run, government needs to raise the overall level of taxation in order to cover, in order to make up for that deficit, and to ensure that in doing so, we protect the most vulnerable and we meet the demands on resources to secure our future. It is crucially important from Social Justice Ireland's perspective that if windfall revenues are going to decline, and if choices have to be made by government about where to spend money, that those who are most vulnerable are not the ones who bear the cost of reduced corporate taxation in the form of a decline in the value of their social welfare rates or our shared services and infrastructure. And really, that's the guiding principle for our proposals this year, as it is every year, that those who are most vulnerable need to be prioritised in any budgetary decisions and in any hard choices that may need to be made. Fundamentally, over the long run, we believe that government needs to move towards a position where we look for a per capita tax take, approximately €15,000 per person in 2017 terms. Of course, this would be done through broadening the tax base rather than simply through measures like income tax, which is not what we're recommending. So, on that note, we will move over to the issue of taxation, and I'll hand over to Mansi, who will talk about some of the recommendations that we are making that can move us towards that target tax take. Mansi, over to you.
Thanks, John. And I mean, you have already covered a lot of the context, so I'll begin by briefly reiterating our position on taxation. We believe that budget decisions must strategically use available resources while building a fairer, more sustainable tax system. And we all know the critical reality that Ireland urgently needs to raise more sustainable recurring tax revenues. There's a current heavy reliance on abnormal corporation tax receipts, and especially in the context of rising global uncertainty around trade wars and geopolitical tensions, which can leave the state vulnerable to serious fiscal shocks. So the tax measures we have proposed here would yield about 4.2 billion in 2026. And this is a step towards reaching the overall per capita tax take target. So the proposals include measures such as strengthening the social insurance fund, like increasing all the PRSI rates by 0.5%, which would yield 900 million starting from budget 2026, and then additional yield of 1.2 billion in a full year from the coming years. And other than that, we propose standard rate pensions-related tax reliefs and standard rating discretionary non-pensions tax reliefs, which would provide stable funding for key supports. And then other tax measures such as increasing CGT and CAT would also provide stable revenue. Other than that, we also propose measures like increasing the vacant home tax to 10 times the annual property tax rate, as well as the rate of residential zone land tax to 5%. And but these measures aren't just about revenue. They're also designed to incentivize behavioral change, bringing back vacant homes and underutilized land back into use. And that ties us directly to our next issue, which is housing. Next slide, please. Ireland is facing a prolonged and worsening housing and homelessness crisis, and there are almost 16,000 people in emergency accommodation with more than 4,800 children. And these are just the official statistics, excluding many others staying with family, friends, or in domestic violence refuges or rough sleepers. So, and what's deeply concerning is how local authority spendings reveal a structural problem. Authorities are spending 15 times more on short-term emergency accommodation than on homeless prevention, and that's not sustainable. We need we need a shift towards prevention-focused policies, including a strong housing-first approach, and we recommend investing in housing first and homelessness prevention through an investment of 100 million, and this can be funded through ending the Help to Buy schemes and other regressive subsidies. And this also highlights the need for more affordable, secure housing. Thus, we propose setting the social housing target to 20% of the total housing stock. This aligns with Housing Commission's recommendations as well as practices across Europe. And to begin with, the government should commit to delivering 20,000 social housing units in 2026, which would require an additional 2 billion investment. This move alone could reduce reliance on housing assistance payments as well and save the state an estimated 250 million per year. We also propose restructuring rent tax credit into renters grant at a cost of 150 million to support low-income renters more directly, and taxing derelict properties through higher levies to encourage development and bring homes back into market. Finally, it's important to acknowledge that the government has repeatedly failed to meet its housing target. So, and it's like high time that we move from reactive measures to more ambitious investment and structural reform. So together, we believe that fair taxation and bold housing actions are not just about economic choices, they're social imperatives, and this needs to be done. With this, I hand it over to my colleague, Suzanne. Thank you.
And I might just come in there before you take over there, Suzanne, and just remind everybody that if you have any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A function. Over to you, Suzanne.
Super. Thanks very much. And again, I suppose a lot of the context has been set out already. The document, I've just checked our website, the document is there as well for people to go through it in a bit more detail, because obviously this is a whistle-stop tour across the top of the document itself. So, I mean, work and social welfare, they sit side by side in our system. We go to many events. I can see a lot of my policy colleagues on the call here. We go to a lot of events where the answer to poverty is work. And if that is the case, what we really need to see is the full implementation of the real living wage. What we see time and time again is a sort of a pushback, you know, from many sectors. A lot of us were at the National Economic Dialogue, and you've got half of the room looking for tax breaks, and the other half of the room is looking for increased funding for their sectors. So somewhere in between those two places, if we go to work for 35, 37, 40 hours a week, at the end of that week, we should be able to provide for the basics. That would really mean a real living wage. It's also linked to housing and transport and childcare and all of those things, but it needs to begin with the living wage. And again, in terms of putting more money back in the pockets of the, you know, individuals who are not earning a huge amount of money, the system of refundable tax credits, again, it's something that we call for year upon year upon year. That would put a dent in the coffers at about 140 million, but at the same time, it will put a huge amount of money back into the pockets of low-income households, which is really necessary. John's already hit on the poverty figures at the moment, and considering that Budget 2026 is not going to introduce or not going to include any temporary measures by all accounts at the moment, something will need to be put in place here. So again, the two main tax credits will need to be increased by €5 a week. Again, putting more money back into the pockets of low-income households and moving that across the system. The core social welfare rate, again, there'll be a little bit more information in the document about benchmarking. Again, I think many of you on the call as well also call for benchmarking of social welfare rates. What it does is it provides certainty for households in receipt of social welfare and also for government. And I think primarily, and again, it's something we're seeing more and more, is certainty across departments where thresholds are impacted in other departments by moves made by the Department of Social Protection. So a benchmarking system would also, I think, make huge dents in that lag that we see. And again, we've been talking about benchmarking thresholds that haven't changed in almost 10 years. So benchmarking would go a long way there. Our benchmark is 27.5% of average weekly earnings, which for 2025 would mean that core social welfare rates would need to rise by a minimum of €22 a week. So we're recommending that social welfare rates would rise by 25 a week. Again, just that tiny little bit extra just to put back in the pockets of those households, because again, we can see from a lot of stuff has come out in the last couple of weeks, but it's those low-income households that are reliant on social welfare are the ones who are in poverty, living in deprivation, consistent poverty, persistent poverty. All of those indicators will come back to this. And again, really important is to equalise the job seekers rates for those under 25. That'll cost 54 million this year. If we can go on to the next slide, please. I'll quickly run through our asks there in community. And again, there's a lot here. And I think the community and voluntary sector, again, I don't need to explain it to anybody on this call, is vital. The amount of services that are provided, the amount of supports that are provided, you can see again, we're going right the way across the spectrum here. Our colleagues in the PPNs need to be supported. The community and voluntary sector will need increases in funding. Youth services, so important when we're looking at exclusion, when we're looking at community cohesion. We're also calling for the resourcing of a loneliness action plan. I know again there's been some other reports done recently that have focused in on loneliness, the physical and mental health impacts of that. Supporting the legal aid board is necessary, vital fundings for library. And again, that forecasting for change piece, which we can come back to later on. But I'd read something recently which really hit it home, which is that excluding people doesn't mean that they cease to exist. So this is so important that that community and voluntary sector is supported to make sure that that they can provide the necessary services that they give, because just because if funding is pulled or if funding is impacted, the work still needs to be done. The work is vital. It really needs to be supported in budget 2026. So I think I've gone slightly over my time there, so I'm going to hand on to my colleague Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So I'm going to quickly run through Rural Ireland health, education and children. So looking at Rural Ireland, we did welcome the commitment in the programme for government to develop and support regional economic development zones. We were very pleased to see that. That will drive, I suppose, expanded public services and a more balanced development approach. So in budget 2026, we're proposing an allocation of €100 million to develop those zones, but also to develop local cooperatives, regional farm to fork strategies, the building on the work that's already been done on rural proofing to develop a robust rural proofing framework to be implemented, to support the plans already in train in terms of the Eastern Regional Assembly and the Northern and Western Regional Assembly in terms of their targets that they have to deliver on, I suppose, the economic development of identified towns and also other infrastructural development. So I think it's important that money is allocated. In addition, we have proposals in terms of, I suppose, supporting Enterprise Ireland and Fall to Ireland to take a more regional approach, particularly in terms of looking at the current labour market in the regions and how we can support new opportunities and how to support that labour market to adapt as we change in terms of climate and digitalisation. Also continued support for rural transport, and that is the rolling out the continued expansion of the local link, also the upgrade of roads, and also that last mile transport piece that does need to be put in place, and the piloting of a farm sustainability passport to support and reward farmers in each of the farm sectors to improve their practices and move to more sustainable practices. Moving on to health, then the next slide, which is page 11 of the document. Obviously, we need to relieve pressure on acute hospitals, reduce the waiting lists, and actually promote preventative care and supporting care for people in the communities, which does require an enhanced and increased investment in enhanced community care. We also need to deliver that one-off investment in the health infrastructure that's required to deliver Sláinte care. So the physical infrastructure that's required to deliver on the priorities of Sláinte care, and to ensure that we can actually deliver on population-based health planning, that the actual building blocks are in place and the physical infrastructure is in place to allow that population-based health planning and population-based health care. Everyone is well aware in terms of the challenges in, accessing GPs, particularly in rural areas. So there is a commitment to universal access to GP care. That's one of the promises that does need to be delivered on. So there needs to be an allocation there to expand that, to provide that, and to expand the community health networks. In addition, investment in community nursing facilities, and to fully implement and staff the sharing the vision strategy. So we have a real challenge at the moment in terms of delivery of mental health services, and it's not necessarily the resource allocation, it's ensuring that we can staff all of those services across the country to ensure that people can access the care and the services that they need when they require that care and that service. Then moving on to the next slide, looking at disability and carers. Government should be implementing and resourcing the necessary services, infrastructure and supports to support independent living in the community for persons with a disability. So we're looking for that to be acknowledged and resourced in Budget 2026. A lot of, promises have been made. It's been a feature of inputs by the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, but I suppose we've yet to see the required resources put into these services. In addition, we really did welcome the commitment in the programme for government to a cost of disability support payment. Now, we believe a weekly payment is more appropriate than an annual payment. We would put that at €20 a week in Budget 2026 to make sure that commitment is realised, and then that can be built on in future budgets. That would come at a cost of €238 million. Additional investment in disability services, including respite and PA services. Then coming to carers, a lot of promises have been made to carers. There was a commitment to a carers guarantee in the previous programme for government, and that commitment remains in the new programme for government. We'd be looking for an increase in the domiciliary care allowance of €25 a month at the cost of €17 million. An increase in the carer support grant, the expansion of the free travel scheme. Also, the government actually does deliver on that commitment to fully fund the carers guarantee, and in doing so actually examines the carers allowance as it stands and the impact that the means assessment as part of that allowance actually has on families and carers. Moving on to education, which is on page 12 of budget choices. So I suppose, some of the main issues here are actually the expansion of the Hot School Meals programme to DEIS post-primary schools. So that there has been a very positive rollout to all primary schools. In Budget 2026, we think this should be rolled out to DEIS post-primary schools, all of the DEIS post-primary schools across the country. In addition, continued funding for DEIS schools, increased support to ensure they can implement the new DEIS strategy that is due at the end of the year and continue to address educational inequality, while ensuring that the pupils that they support can meet their educational goals. The government did make a welcome commitment, which we've consistently asked for, to reduce the pupil-teacher ratio at primary level. We're looking for a more ambitious commitment, so a 1.5 point reduction rather than just a 1 point reduction. So that would come at a cost of 70 million. Also the expansion of the JCSP library project to all DEIS schools, so an investment of 5 million every year for 5 years. And finally then, in terms of primary and post-primary, an expansion of the school places for children with special needs. I mean, despite much work and many promises, you know, every September families cannot find places for their children. So we are suggesting a 54 million allocation to provide 300 additional schools places in new special schools and 46 million to increase the provision of special classes in mainstream schools. Now, looking to further and higher education, which has been in the news in recent days, particularly around the student contribution, you know, there's a gap to be closed that has been identified by the Department of Public Expenditure in just the funding for higher education of over 307 million. So we're looking for an investment to begin to close that gap over 3 budgets in 2026, an increase in the maintenance grant for full-time students at the cost of 48 million euros. That would cover students in PLC courses, further education and higher education. Increased funding for apprenticeships, then using an increased employer's contribution to support training and skills development in new sectors, you know, to support the electrification of our heating systems, for example, to support the electrification of vehicles, to support our circular economy goals. So those are the kind of things we need to be investing in and upskilling and training people. Now, moving then on to children. We are proposing an increase in child benefit of 50 euros a month, an increase in the qualified child payments of 6 euros for those who are under 12 and 15 euros for those who are over 12. And then a move to the investment, increased investment in early childhood care and education of 1.1% of GNI Star, which equates to 332 million euros a year, to actually move us to where we need to be in terms of the OECD average. Also, if you're really going to deliver for families and children, we need to look at parental and paternity leave and an expanded 2 weeks in terms of each, supporting for TUSLA, supporting social provision for children, to fully implement the EU Child Guarantee Strategy, which we have developed, which government developed last year, and also then to really support those families who are in very vulnerable positions, so those women and children who need refuge spaces, who need support in terms of dealing with domestic violence. So we still have room to make up there, particularly in terms of the number of refuge spaces that are required. And so we'll be looking for increased funding of 221 million euros in the budget to begin to provide support for these very vulnerable groups. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mansi to look at older people.
Thanks, Michelle. And in this, I'll cover the needs of an aging population. So to begin with, like, aging population should be seen as a success of policy and public health, but that success also brings responsibility to plan properly and to invest wisely, so older people have the security, care, and independence that they deserve. I mean, John has also already mentioned the poverty figures, and I just wanted to add to that older people are also particularly vulnerable to cost of living pressures, as most of them live on fixed incomes. And to give some statistics, in 2024, the Silk data showed that over 106,000 older people were living in poverty, which is an increase of 64% compared to the previous year. And this number would have been substantially higher were it not for the one-off measures. So this again clearly shows the need for sustainable solutions, and thus we're calling on the government to increase the state pension by 25 euro per week and introduce a universal state social welfare pension in budget 2026 at an additional cost of 2.2 billion. To also help older people age well at home, as most want to do, we propose an additional allocation of 8.9 million in budget 2026 for housing adaptations. And to deliver, we also call on the government to deliver on the promised statutory right to home care and increase home care provision by 96.4 million. we welcome the we also welcome the recent progress made in recognizing the essential work of the community and voluntary sector, including the move towards fair pay. And we hope that this would, to build on this, this would mean that there's a multi-annual funding which would be allocated, and it is absolutely essential to support effective planning and ensure these services continue to meet both current and future needs, which brings us to the next point, which is of acute mental health services, which remain under-resourced. And recent reports, including the policy document, A Vision for Change, has recommended that at least 8 beds for older adults is needed for every 50 acute mental health beds. And this would mean that at least 450 beds for older people would be required by 2030. And to meet this need, we recommend starting with a minimum investment of 25.6 million annually, and for older people. And finally, on safeguarding, more than a third of all safeguarding reports made to HSC's safeguarding office in 2023 were made by older people, people aged 65 plus. And while we welcome the Law Commission's framework for adult safeguarding, we urge for progress to be made on the adult safeguarding bill, which is urgently needed. And with this, we also call on the government to establish an independent safeguarding authority at an initial cost of 3 million in budget 2026. And with this, I hand it over back to Michelle.
Thank you, Mansi. So we're just going to look at it. This was environmental issues now, and a just transition, which is on page 14 of the document. So this was on the taxation side here. You know, we've made this proposal for a number of years because there's no tax on jet kerosene. That while progressing this at an EU level, the government should implement an aviation tax on commercial air travel. That would yield about 15 million in a year. Also to introduce an aggregate levy of €2.50 per tonne, so that's on things like sand, gravel, blocks, to yield 75 million in a year. Use the carbon tax funding, which is expected to yield the increased carbon taxes about 154 million, to ensure that this funding is used to provide for a just transition. And by that, I mean actually used to fund new programs and supports for people, not to fund, I suppose, existing supports within other departments, particularly around, I suppose, income supports that actually should be funded by, you know, through current government expenditure and not through using the carbon tax, because ultimately the carbon tax funding should increase and some of those supports will still have to be funded. In terms of renewable energy, then expansion of renewable energy programs, particularly, I suppose, looking at rural housing, and fund community energy advisors in every county, I suppose, to reach those very vulnerable home owners or people who are renting, to ensure that they can take advantage of retrofitting supports, investing in our biodiversity, in circular economy, to support a building renovation passport scheme so that people can renovate their homes or upgrade their homes and their heating systems on a step-by-step basis. Not everyone has the money to avail of a full upgrade up front, and you know, I think it's more appropriate to allow people to do this on a step-by-step basis. In terms of the one-off measures, we do need an upgrade of the national grid, not only to support home building, but also to make sure that actually we can meet our renewable energy targets. We need to build new storage capacity on the grid so that any of the renewable energy that's generated during the day can be stored and then used to lower bills for consumers and for businesses. We also need to invest in interconnectors to ensure that whatever capacity is there can be moved. Also looking at electric vehicles, while there has been a welcome take-up of electric vehicles, generally they're in the wrong places because they're predominantly in urban areas where people have public transport that they can be avail of. And if you really want to, I suppose, look at journey emissions, you need to ensure that electric vehicle grants are targeted at rural dwellers I suppose we're not the only people to have recommended this. So looking at a grant of you know, up to 10,000 euros, between 6 and 10,000 euros, depending on income, and also home charging grants increased to 600 euros for rural dwellers. That would, you know, looking at the obviously 48 million in year one, looking at how you might expand that, but this has to be delivered on alongside major public transport projects to things like the metro and other projects that will take large volumes of people out of their cars and into journeys that are produce less emissions. But alongside that, you need to make sure that if we are, I suppose, investing in supporting in electric vehicles, that the electrification of vehicles is actually going to where the longest journeys are being made and supporting those people in moving to electric vehicles. And now I'm going to pass over to Suzanne.
Thanks, Michelle. Just to very quickly then look at our international protection system. Notable in Programme for Government that it has moved away from a process of integration now into one where you know, accommodation is much more regulated. There will be restrictions supposedly put on people's movements within that. So it's an interesting space to see kind of what it is that they are going to do next. But I mean, the white paper, the day report, it seems to have disappeared, but the need for what was suggested and proposed in the day report is growing, you know, daily. So this really needs to be appropriate, not-for-profit accommodation. An initial investment we recommend of 600 million, which would be funded from, you know, the sort of the current bounty we have. And I suppose for context, there was a recent PQ that showed 1 billion a year is spent on IPAS. Now, that didn't really break it down in terms of, you know, sort of state and for profit. But when you look at the IPAS stats, more and more are in emergency or temporary accommodation, which would suggest that that is in a for-profit system. And regardless of how altruistic, how kind, how supportive the staff in those for-profit centres undoubtedly are, I would hope that they are, the bottom line for all of that system is profit. And this is not something that's temporary. This is not something that's going to go away. Ireland is a safe, secure country. It is a success story that is to be celebrated. And it means that you can come and live here. There will be economic opportunities, there will be education opportunities, there will be opportunities for women that aren't available in other parts of the world. And again, every time you switch on your radio or your TV, what you're seeing is climate chaos. What you're seeing is, again, you know, rates of conflict that we haven't seen in almost 100 years. People are on the move. We really need to be prepared for that. And that also needs to be part of the conversation as well about the vision. I think that the long-term vision for Ireland and how we're going to plan for Ireland's future, and that will definitely rely on the movement of people around the world. So how do we embrace that? How do we plan for that? How do we provide for these people? And it will require, again, you know, the assessments, the vulnerability assessments and other supports to be put in place as well. Navigating the system, just in terms of basic admin, but also that sort of trauma-informed care that needs to be provided to people who have come here seeking international protection. I think that's really, really key, is that this is, again, it's a safe, secure place. People come here for a myriad of reasons, but that safety is the key one. So thank you. I'm going to hand back to John then to see us out. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So maybe now we'll just turn to looking at our overseas development assistance. And just to note that we need to move to our commitment of 0.7% of GNI star for overseas development assistance. We have laid out a pathway towards that by 2030. It's all laid out on page 16. And to do so, therefore, we recommend in 2026 a budget of 205.7 million be allocated. That will bring us a step of the way. That will bring us to 0.57% of GNI star. And then over the next 4 years after that to the 0.7%. I suppose it's important to acknowledge that 2030 is also the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we are to make progress on eliminating world poverty and addressing the full range of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to make our contribution to that internationally. In addition to that, government has done well to increase the funding towards climate finance and has reached the 225 million target that government set for itself. However, our big concern is that they have done so within the ODA budget. And we believe that actually these are two separate commitments, and as such, they need to be delivered separately. We therefore recommend that in 2026, that 225 million be funded for this year or for next year through windfall revenue, so that the funding in place for ODA can be sustained to reach the 0.7%. And then over the coming years, we need to begin again drawing on recurring revenue streams in order to fund that 225 million for climate finance. The other area we need to look at there is also costs for loss and damage, and that's another area that we need to see where government can do more in terms of financing that. So what I might just now do is wrap up by bringing everybody through a quick summary of the various packages that we've discussed, laid out by Mansi, Suzanne, and Michelle. Overall, you can see here on page 18 of our Budget Choices 2026, there's a full layout of the gains and the costs of the various packages. In terms of windfall, you can see we're talking about spending 4.8 billion out of that windfall revenue that we'll have next year. That will go, as has been mentioned, on a number of things, including substantial increase in social housing, where we're looking at almost 2 billion. The 225 million for the climate finance that I mentioned, as well as the 600 million for international protection accommodation that Suzanne mentioned, and 600 million for investment in Sláintecare infrastructure, as mentioned by Michelle. In addition to that, you can see we actually are looking at having a net gain in terms of our proposals for housing, and that overall it should actually raise 285 million for the Exchequer. Likewise, with the Just Transition package, there is again a net gain of 161 million that we brought into the Exchequer. In terms of rural, regional, community development, we're looking at an investment package of 285 million. In terms of social protection, we're looking at a net package of 1.3 billion. For pensions and older people, 1.6 billion. For education, 523 million. For health, disability and carers, bringing them all together, we're looking at a package of 870 million. For children and families, we're looking at a package of an investment of 1.6 billion. And for international protection, a package of 218 million. And then in terms of the revenue raising measures mentioned by Mansi, we're looking at 896 million being raised through capital and corporate taxes, and then 327 million being raised through increases to the income tax credits system. So that really lays out our proposals for Budget 2026. What we might do now is take questions. So I believe a number of you are popping questions into the Q&A as we were going along. If you have any other questions, please input them into the Q&A and we can address them as we're going. So I'll just stop the screen share now and we will take some of the questions that are already in the Q&A. Okay, so I have a question here, maybe most appropriate for Michelle, from Andrew Rooney. Andrew asks, I would appreciate more information on the cost of disability payment. Is this payment on those figures of those in receipt of a disability allowance or a disability related payment? If so, which ones were used? And sorry, rather than Michelle, maybe Suzanne might want to come on that. Either of you.
Well, I guess just to Suzanne might give the background, but in terms, yeah, it's those in receipt of disability allowance and the invalidity pension. those two numbers combined, and then you know, €20 a week payment. So that's where the figure comes from. Suzanne might give some of the background around our reasoning behind it.
That's it. I mean, there's been plenty of research. I'd imagine everybody's probably familiar with the Indicon report at this stage, which is now out of date. And you know, other work has been done since then by other organisations, but that trying to put a number on the cost of disability, because it does vary from individual to individual, and I know there's a real challenge there, but there is an acknowledgement that living with a disability adds to your daily living costs. And what we see across the board is that the current payment either covers the extra cost of your disability or just covers your basic living costs and doesn't cover any of the extra costs linked with your disability. So I mean, really, like, it's a vital payment. And I know in Programme for Government, Michelle, isn't it, it's mooted to be an annual payment. And really what we would like to see is that it would be paid weekly, because that's how most of us live our lives. We, you know, we go to the supermarket once a week, we top up on our toiletries, we pay our bills little by little, just to give a bit more certainty, I think, and to sort of spread that out. It just makes your money, just makes it easier to manage. But, you know, we need to start somewhere, I think, really is. And I know there was, again, anybody who's in the space would be familiar with the Green Paper. Work has been started and postponed for the moment, so it will be an interesting space to watch. So I suppose that is the background, is at least there's an acknowledgement that this payment is very necessary, and then it's just a case of trying to get it up and running and started. So this would be our proposal to at least begin that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Another question here from Rebecca Gorman. What do you think about the move away from energy poverty to one of energy affordability, and how will this impact on people on low incomes? And actually, Suzanne, I might come back to you on that.
I might weigh in on this one. I mean, we've seen ginormous amounts of money moving around the system to try and keep people's lights on and keep the heat on, between the energy credits, between ANPs, between the MABS hardship funds, between the amazing work that SVP and others do in this space. I think we really need to be looking at, because I think that fundamentally for me, that goes back to, this is a basic good that we all use, which is now fundamentally unaffordable. So with the best will in the world, no amount of budgeting or no amount of it's going to cover your basic costs. So I think they're really going to have to start looking at the cost of energy and also retrofitting homes. On a personal note, we got our house wrapped during the summer. There's been some cold days. I know we would have had the heat on here all day. It hasn't happened once. But another part of the conversation is, I was in London the weekend and it was 34 degrees. And the conversation there was about the winter fuel payments for older people to be able to manage their winter heating bills. There's going to have to be a conversation as well, if climate change goes the way it is, that summer electricity costs will also need to be factored in, because you'll have the fan on, you'll have the, you know, bottled water in your freezers, all of this kind of thing. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but we might have the chats at some stage anyway, but I think it's going to have to be a conversation that's moving away from just constantly feeding money into people's bills. And again, when you look at the figures from the Commission for Regulations of Utilities, I haven't looked at the last arrears, but generally somewhere between 20 to 25% of gas and electricity customers are in arrears at any given time. So even with all of those supports, there's still this cohort who simply cannot afford to pay their bills at the rate that the bills are currently, you know, currently being calculated at, and even with smart meters and all of that kind of thing. So there's an awful lot of work that'll need to be done, but it'll have to be the solar piece, the retrofitting, all of that, I think, just to bring bills down.
Thanks, Suzanne. We have actually a questioner that's raises a good point, just for everybody tuning into the webinar, which is where can Socialist Ireland's publication be downloaded from? You can get it on the website. So you can get it. In fact, yes, it has been shared there. Oh no, maybe that's only available to panelists. But yeah, if you go to the Social Justice Ireland website at socialjustice.ie, you can see front and center our publication, 2 locations. One is in the publication section along the right-hand side of the website, and the other is in the top article on the website. So it can be downloaded from both places, laying out all of the detail we're discussing now. We have another question here. I'm conscious of time, but I think we can squeeze this one in from Sive O'Neill. She says, thank you for your great work. Can you outline measures you're recommending specifically to address energy poverty? We've already addressed that. And potential for increased energy costs over the coming years due to Ireland's import dependency and exposure to rising commodity prices. Also, grid improvements and balancing capacity costs passed down to householders and small businesses. So I suppose in terms of the energy affordability piece, maybe we've already looked at it, but maybe more broadly around the costs around importing or import dependency and the electricity grid, etc. Maybe Michelle, you might come in on that front.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so a couple of points, and I made one in the presentation about what the carbon tax is funding, and I suppose our position is energy poverty, as Susanna's pointed out, is poverty, you know, so that needs to be addressed within the department itself and not through a fund that will reduce over time. In terms of energy costs, yes, we do face the potential for substantial increases in energy costs over the coming years because we import so much, and actually a lot of our, you know, the reduced emissions from our energy are actually to the fact that most of those emissions are booked with the UK, you know, before they come across in the interconnector. So it is a real challenge, which is why I suppose we have our proposals around expanding storage capacity in order to deliver on our renewable energy targets. And then the question arrives, I suppose, to your question is, so where should this renewable energy go? And ultimately, if government does want to support households and businesses with higher costs, the one way it can do that is by reducing energy bills. So I guess we have to look at then as the pressure on the system. So for example, where is the renewable energy that we generate going to go? Should it be diverted to households and businesses to reduce their costs, or is it going to be eaten up by data centers, for example? And I suppose that's a question for government, and it hasn't been addressed. I suppose Friends of the Earth would have done a lot of work on this in terms of absolutely that energy should be going to reduce the costs for households and businesses. And we would concur with that, because I suppose if you, as John pointed out at the beginning, it is the principle of fairness and the common good. So any benefits that we get from renewable energy and being able to store it so it's not wasted at night, so that the energy that's produced and not used during the day or at night can be used the next day to reduce bills, that should go to reduce costs for consumers, for households and for businesses. And that's key. And in terms of, I suppose, the balancing capacity costs and how you improve the grid, there is a fund there. Obviously, we would argue that, you know, the 2 funds introduced, the Climate Infrastructure Fund and the Infrastructure Fund, the Climate and Nature Fund, and they're welcome, but there's also substantial issues that need to be funded now. And within that, I think the state does need to take the hit in terms of funding that increased capacity, and then looking at how you balance costs to businesses and consumer, because ultimately, it looks like the state is going to be spending a lot of money to try and reduce costs for businesses. I suppose it's commitments around VAT. That's a very expensive thing to do. Is it the right thing to do? Are those, you know, those reductions passed on to consumers? That's questionable at a time when costs continue to increase. I think a better way to do that would be to reduce energy costs for businesses and consumers, because that would be a more permanent reduction and sustainable over time. So look, I hope that answers the question, Sive.
I just go in one very quick thing. This always ties in as well, like conversations about financial literacy. So what you get from the likes of the Commission for Regulation of Utilities is that we are, as consumers, have been provided with the information. So there's 15 different tariffs and they put a smart meter in. and we should be able to figure out what the best deal for us is. I do think like the energy companies, again, I think, you know, do have a bit of work to do. I don't even know, why do you have 15 tariffs? Why is there not just, what's the cheapest tariff? Just put us all on the cheapest tariff. It shouldn't be that hard. So there's definitely an awful lot that they can do, I think, to reduce the cost. But we need to be using less energy, and it needs to be cheaper as well. Is just as that kind of overall conversation going forward.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Suzanne. And I am just quickly sharing with everybody the link to Budget Choices 2026. I think that should reach everybody tuning into the webinar today. But as I said already, it's also available. You can go directly to our website, socialjustice.ie, and download it there. We're coming up on 1 p.m. So our hour is nearly coming to a conclusion. I just want to thank Mansi, Suzanne, and Michelle, and not only for the work at the webinar here today, but also for all the work put into preparing our Budget Choices briefing. I want to thank everybody who tuned in today, and I would ask you all to download a document, have a read of it, and use it in your own work, and also as an advocacy tool, which is how we'll be using it in advance of Budget 2026. We will, as we do every year, be providing an in-depth comprehensive analysis of Budget 2026 the day after it's announced in October, and we'll be publishing that, as we do every year, within 24 hours of the budget announcement, and with a live seminar and launch in Buzzwells Hotel across the road from Leinster House. So again, thank you all very much for tuning in, and have a good day.